Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 1st of December 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. And joining me today via Skype is Brian Gerrish, who is still at home. Brian, welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'm still at home. Pleased to say I'm feeling better, but still a few bugs floating around. So I'm in a safe zone at the moment.
Okay. Well, look, we're going to get straight on with it because we've got a lot to get through today. And the great news, as I'm sure you will agree, is that Tony Blair has been found innocent by Parliament. And this was following the debate in Parliament and vote yesterday, led by Alex Salmond of the SNP and also Caroline Lucas of the Green Party. They were attempting to hold Blair to account for misleading Parliament leading up to the Iraq War. Well, there was a debate and everybody decided that actually it's perfectly all right. Everything that Tony did was fine. And of course, this kind of sets a precedent for future behaviour by leaders in the UK. This is a travesty, Brian.
Well, it's a travesty, Mike, but of course, totally expected because let's just put ourselves in the shoes of the MPs. I know that's a difficult thing to do, but let's just do it. They know that if they allowed a proper process to go through against Tony Blair, he was to be brought in front of a court of law. They are all liable to the same treatment. So I don't think this is to do necessarily with Tony Blair as an individual man protecting Tony Blair. This is because if they allow a proper process of law to take Tony Blair, of course, that process of law is capable of taking any of them. And they don't want that to happen. So we've now got a real indication that the British Parliament in Westminster is above the law. And let's remember that it was Tony Blair back in the year 2000, who via IPPR, the policy group, said that his vision of the future was appointed people who would be the new leaders of society. So Tony Blair himself was pointing to Britain 2016 beyond, where we would be led by people who were appointed, nothing to do with democracy. And that being the case, we can expect those people to be above the law. So what's in my mind, the British Constitution Group conference at Westminster, and what was the topic of that? The fact that Britain is now a lawless state. And we have a parliament which thinks it's above the law.
Winchester, of course. But anyway, the other aspect of this, Brian, is they want to give Tony a clean bill of health because, of course, he wants to worm his way back into British politics.
Well, that's true, Mike. But I did read something in one of the newspapers earlier in the week where Tony Blair was actually saying, I'm not really sure that I can come fully back into mainstream politics because the public and the press in particular are going to be so aggressive. And I was quite interested with that because I thought it gave us a little look into his mind, that he knows that out there are millions of people who, if they could, would have him in front of a court for war crimes. So he may be putting on a brave face, but I think inside Tony Blair's actually a very frightened man. But yeah, the judgment in Westminster, complete whitewash to protect all MPs, whatever their crimes.
Absolutely. And of course, the other person who likes to protect people's crimes is Alison Saunders.
Well, indeed. And although this took place at the beginning of the month, one of our viewers kindly flagged it up. And I thought it was important because she was giving evidence in front of one of the committees. And if we just pop on to the next slide, we'll get the important information. Because what she was actually saying was that basically we need to stay in the European Union Arrest Warrant system. If I can read this, there is a package.
I can read it. It says there's a package of measures that we think are really important. They are not just the obvious ones, such as the European Arrest Warrant, which is absolutely vital and of which we make a great deal of use. It starts right at the beginning. The package around the European Arrest Warrant works because we have also SIS2, the Schengen Information System. That helps us because when we issue European Arrest Warrants, we do not just issue to a particular country, we go to all 27. That package is absolutely vital.
Yeah, so there we are, Mike. This lady is saying, well, hang on a minute, we can't move away from the European Union because we need to stay using the European Arrest Warrant system. In the information which I read around this, she was also saying, well, it's very slow, it's very difficult to set up agreements with individual nation states. So all of the very regimes that we've had in the past are apparently now too difficult. We must stay locked into the EU in order to participate in their pan-European arrest warrant system. And of course, if we stay in the arrest warrant system, we're going to have to stay linked in with the European police force system. What are we getting here? We're getting a clue, another clue. There is no Brexit. The agenda is to keep the UK fully locked into the EU system.
Absolutely right. Now, I wanted to bring this up again because we mentioned this yesterday. This report in the Italian press accusing the Financial Times of an act of financial terrorism. And this was over this article here, basically threatening multiple bank failures in Italy if Prime Minister Renzi loses the referendum. Now, I said that this referendum was about whether they want to be in the Eurozone or not. Of course, it's not about that. What I'd intended to say was whether they wanted to bring down the Eurozone or not. And of course, this is why the Financial Times is getting so upset about it. So the referendum itself is about constitutional reform and Renzi attempting to remove some senators and so on. I'm not quite clear yet what that constitutional reform package means for Italy. I want to look at it in a little bit more detail, but what is clear that that one of the things that Renzi wants to do is to push through a package of financial reforms, which the European Union doesn't like very much. And just to give sort of a bit of an impression of where Renzi's coming from, he had a package of aid, for example, for people from that were affected by the recent earthquakes in Italy. And he wanted to give them a package of money. The European Union said, no, you can't do that. You can only give half of that amount. And so really, there is a schism developing between the Renzi government and the rest of the European Union. This referendum is part and parcel of that. They want to make sure that he doesn't lose that referendum. And they're getting pretty upset about it, should he do so. So, Brian, we're seeing the same kind of situation in so many different countries in Europe.
Into the visible politics of a nation state, whether it's Italy or another country.
Absolutely right. Okay, so Steve Baker, Brian, what's he up to?
It's a shame. We had hope that David Ellis was going to be with us, but I'm going to pick up on what David's been talking about. This is an MP who's very outspoken, apparently, about the EU. We need to get out of the EU. But he's also puts himself forward as being a huge supporter of the armed forces. And we're just picking up some very strange information around this man and indeed other politicians. They're saying they're for one thing, but when you actually challenge them and and put them on the spot, something else emerges. If we can just follow through this little sequence of slides. The next one, if we bring this up, this was key. Dave Ellis tackled this man over what we are seeing about the continued work to bring UK military into the EU military system. So we're told Brexit is going on, but if we look at what's actually taking place, Britain's military is being sucked into the EU at an ever quicker rate. We know that the EU command and control structure, which has been set up in UK, can be activated within 24 hours. We know that we've got massive numbers of European armed forces personnel working in UK's military bunker up in London. They're also down in St Morgan in Cornwall. So the government is saying we're working for Brexit, we're coming away, but that doesn't appear to be the case. And one would have thought that Mr. Baker, when informed of the reality, would have been asking questions straight away. Where is your information? This is very serious. What can I do about it? But what Dave Ellis has said is no sooner was the subject of the continued integration mentioned than Mr. Steve Baker ran a mile. So this next slide is one of the organisations that he says he's supporting. This is Veterans for Britain. And of course, this is one of the key groups. There's a number of them where ex-military people who are getting very, very nervous about what's going on are trying to organise themselves and put pressure on the government. So Mr. Baker involved, but when he is given irrefutable evidence of the continued integration of UK's military into the EU, he runs away. And what we're getting is a sense that maybe some of these groups have become very vulnerable to what? Infiltration by government representatives? Is this what's going on? We can't say for certain at the moment, but you get a sense of unease that good people who are worried about their country are being controlled. I think the right word is.
Yeah, Brian, I said this to you a week or so ago. I've noticed a number of cases recently of the Charity Commission getting involved with veterans groups and criticising veterans groups and beginning to start investigations into these groups. And I don't know what the reason for that is, but I just begin to, from what you've just said, I begin to smell perhaps a political agenda there.
Well, I think you're spot on, Mike. And yes, I remember the conversation we had. I think that what this is about is, of course, retired ex-military people are exceptionally dangerous to the government because they're trained people. They know how to organise themselves. I would say most of them have got a lot of loyalty to their country. And of course, if they were to find out as a body the criminal action that's currently going on in Westminster, they would be a powerful force. So, and there is a lot of them. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of men and women out there in Britain who, if they were properly motivated and organised, could pose a big challenge to the government and what's happening. So what I think the government has done is it's encouraged the setting up of more and more little charities and non-government organisations. They attract veterans. The websites say the right things. They say that they're after saving the armed forces, looking after veterans, all the right language. And then along come the veterans, and these organisations then make sure that they don't actually achieve anything worthwhile. This is the control valve system. And I believe that this is an orchestrated effort by the government in order to strip the power away from veterans in Britain.
But Steve Baker has links to Lehman.
Well, this is where it gets fascinating. You know, who are you dealing with? Of course, to the military or to the veterans, he says, "Well, I'm one of you because I'm a former RAF engineer." But if we get into his career, well, he's done some military work, but then he's boasting that he was responsible for risk management for Lehman Brothers. So he was determining the strategy for the critical functioning of maintaining and controlling the risk associated with many billions of dollars of assets under management.
Well, that worked out well.
Well, he kind of done very well because, of course, Lehman Brothers went bust. So how is it that this ex-military man can be boasting of his skills in the banking industry when the bank he was working for and risk managing goes bust? There's something going on here, and we've come back to the banks yet again. So if we bring David Cameron up on screen here, we're just reminding people of the sorts of thing Cameron was saying, because apparently he was fighting for our interests, challenging the EU. But what I wanted to highlight is in this report going back to 2015, we actually had Steve Baker, leader of Conservatives for Britain, said it was increasingly clear that EU membership is not compatible with either parliamentary control of domestic law or our borders. So Steve Baker said that back in 2015. So how is it that in 2016, December 2016, Mr. Baker is running away from information saying the same EU, which is dangerous to our borders, is sucking in the UK military? Something doesn't stack up. And of course, the evidence is there. And another reminder here, this is a report where whatever the papers were saying about Cameron, truth was coming out here from Luxembourg Prime Minister Bettel, President of the European Council, says that ever closer union is the aim of the EU. And that is exactly what we're seeing continue. Brexit, as you have said, is a psyop, it's a complete lie.
Absolutely. So, arrogance, ignorance, and collaboration with a foreign power. Well, we've covered this one before, but this is.
We have, but let's bring it back in, because I have to say that the UK column has been on the button so many times in the past. So let's have a look at this one. This was a report from months ago where we were saying what is going on with senior officers. So the UK column exposed that the Franco-British Council was one of the charities that was used to bring in this defence arrangement with the French. The British public were never told about it. There was suddenly an announcement of a 50-year pact with the French. And this whole thing had been stitched together behind closed doors with the help of the charity, the Franco-British Council. Now, apparently all of these senior officers, they were the ones on screen there, none of them knew anything about it. And they still don't know anything about it. They are rather so arrogant that they don't bother to pay attention to what people say to them, or it's utter ignorance, or it's something else. But if we have a look at this amazing letter, retired Army Major wrote Telegraph on the 29th of November. This was sent through to me, and we've got a retired major commenting on the situation in the Navy. So here's the title: Disarmed Navy. Sir, Admiral Sir Philip Jones, the First Sea Lord, commentary November 25th, admits that the Royal Navy has been contracting for the past 38 years, his entire career. He also says that all RN ships that have the surface-to-surface anti-ship missile, the Harpoon, will have it withdrawn next year. And you just press, it will go on to the next bit, Mike. There we are. As a former infantry officer, I find it utterly incredible that the head of the Navy is prepared to send his 8,000 sailors on operations without the means to defend themselves against other ships. It's like deploying artillery without any shells to fire, or infantry without any bullets for their rifles. His decision, like those of many senior officers in all three services, seems driven more by political considerations than by the operational needs of the sailors he is privileged to command. Major John Rylance. So my point is here, it takes a retired Army major to put his finger right on the button, but we've got all of these senior officers, whether they're Army officers, Royal Navy officers or Air Force, who seem, for whatever reason, incapable of understanding what's going on. So yesterday I tweeted this one out, and if you press the red button, Mike, it'll bring me to that tweet. I tweeted out the letter from Major John Rylands, and then I made some comment on it, because I said that basically senior military officers seem to be suffering from artificial intelligence. And of course, what that really is arrogance and ignorance. And so, despite all of the reports in the press, the fact that we haven't got any engineers, we haven't got any missile systems, we haven't got operational aircraft carriers, fixed wing aircraft, maritime patrol aircraft, missiles, we haven't got any of these things. These senior officers apparently still don't understand that the Navy is, the military is simply being decimated.
Well,
I'm lost for words on some of it.
Well, I have to say, Brian, they may not understand that, but it's pretty clear that the politicians understand that, because today there was an announcement that the families of anybody killed or injured on active duty in a combat situation will be entitled to a larger compensation pot. And what this is about is a limitation within the law, because there's a common law limitation on the circumstances under which compensation can be paid. So this results in a lot of court cases then where families feel that they are owed a little bit more. They go to court and say, for example, somebody is killed or injured as a result of faulty equipment or poorly provisioned equipment, and that would not be covered under the common law situation. So they go to court to try to get a judgment. And what the government is saying is, well, we want to increase the compensation available so that we discourage families from going to court to get this extra compensation. And Fallon is saying here, our armed forces put their lives on the line to keep us safe. This new scheme will mean a more generous payments to anyone injured or the families of those who are killed in combat. But basically, what it seems to be to me, Brian, is a clear acknowledgement by the government that they're hollowing out the military from the middle. They're going to be liable for many more of these types of court cases in the future, and therefore they want to try and sort of sidestep all that.
Well, indeed, and it ties in so nicely with what we've discussed earlier on the veterans and the power of veterans. Obviously, able-bodied veterans can go on and they can have other careers, and therefore they're going to be a little more modest, I think, in any demands that they put on the government. But of course, people who've come out suffering injuries, lost limbs through whatever fault of the government, these are very quite rightly angry people, and they are going to go for the government. So I think you're right. What we've got going on here is the attempt to get in amongst people who are going to bring the government to account, to try and defuse it, to try and take the power away. I would say if Mr. Fallon is talking, we can be pretty confident that what he says is an utter lie. This seems to be the measure of this man.
Absolutely. Well, he's not the only one talking, so we'll just bring in Sir Stuart Peach, who's the Chief of the Defence Staff, and make sure we know what he's saying as well. He's saying clarifying combat immunity and offering better compensation will remove the need for legal action, and the courts will no longer have to second-guess military decisions. So they're clearly nervous about this.
Oh, I think they're very nervous, Mike. And let's bring in another subject, just because it's there at the back of my mind, which is the anti-malarian drug Lariam. Of course, the MOD was giving this drug, knowing it was causing huge problems. It continued, despite all of the evidence, to give this drug to servicemen and women. The Americans regard it as being so dangerous they pulled it out of service. But the MOD continued to administer it. And to be fair to the drug company itself, Of course, they said, well, one of the things that's going on is the MOD is administering Larium as part of a cocktail of other drugs that it's giving to servicemen and women before they deploy. And of course, the safety guidelines for Larium says this should not be done. What did the MOD do? Well, it held a series of secret meetings, one of which the UK column discovered. And despite the fact that I think it's Glaxo is the producer of Larium, maybe I'll be corrected on that, but I think it's GSK. Basically, they sent along a representative, a lady, who quite rightly took the MOD to task and said that the adverse effects of this drug are the fault of the MOD because they're not administering it properly. What happened? A complete cover-up by the British Ministry of Defence and no proper investigative reporting by mainstream media. They are very frightened, I think.
Okay, well, look, just before we move on, surely this suggests very strongly that the lessons of Gulf War syndrome were never learned, rather.
Well, it depends what we think Gulf War syndrome was and was designed to achieve. At the end of the day, I think the evidence is overwhelming that the British Ministry of Defence and the US Ministry of Defence knew full well that the cocktail of drugs that were being given were causing problems, and certainly the evidence that's come forward from the hundreds of thousands of victims subsequently shows it. But if your agenda from the outset is to damage the physical and mental health of troops so that you're removing the effectiveness of those forces and you're producing a river of damaged veterans, if that is your primary objective, then they've done extremely well. It follows with Larium. And I can imagine somebody listening to that statement and saying, well, my goodness, why would the British government want to hurt its own servicemen and women? Well, the simple answer to that is that it's becoming increasingly clear that our government is not interested in the best interests of the wider public, be it through the NHS or schools, whatever we look at. The evidence is that we are being attacked by our own government. And who are they going to attack with vehemence? They're going to go for military people because they can be dangerous.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's make a bit of progress through some of the slides. This from RT: the Russian Navy on combat alert as Ukraine begins missile launch drills near Crimea. We continue to see this pressure building against Russia. This is I can't even put into words how dangerous this is. But if we look at what else is going on, we've got Aleppo, of course, in its final days, eastern Aleppo at least, and Matthew Rycroft in the United Nations complaining bitterly about the continuing operation in eastern Aleppo. He's asking, what will it take? Syria is in the midst, he says, of an horrific conflict, and the worst is probably yet to come. He said, I've met members of Syrian civil society, and I find that very interesting that he's singling out Syrian civil society, of course, because we're talking about the NGO complex there. And they tell me what you would expect. The bombs are directly responsible for the greatest number of deaths. To stop the deaths, stop the bombing. So he's calling for a no-fly zone. And I'm just going to highlight the hypocrisy following on from what we did yesterday of this, because while he is complaining bitterly in the United Nations about what the Syrian army and the Russian support are doing in East Aleppo, of course, civilian casualties are absolutely mounting within Mosul. And Reuters a few days ago reporting this, civilian casualties from Mosul are overwhelming capacity, according to the United Nations. We've got other reports, Mosul facing catastrophic water shortages as a result of the bombardment. But let's not forget that, Britain is there in Mosul, bombing ISIS out of Mosul. And Brian, it staggers me that the hypocrisy in this, that we can be complaining bitterly about one exercise to remove terrorists out of one city, and in a very nearby city, at least in global terms anyway, we are ourselves involved in exactly the same type of operation, but that's okay. It's okay that Iraqi civilians are being killed and injured by our bombs, but it's not okay if Syrian civilians are being killed by Syrian and Russian bombs. Where in both cases, it's absolutely clear that the civilians are only there because they're being kept there by terrorists.
Well, we're starting to put the picture together very nicely, Mike, with the emphasis there on Tony Blair being found innocent. So Blair, who clearly lied to the British public in order to start the wars going in Iraq and the Middle East, he's protected. And what does that mentality show us? It shows us that basically what we do is okay, but if other people do something similar, it's not okay. It's unbelievable hypocrisy, and it's unbelievably dangerous. I read some material earlier this morning where, of course, the Russians are saying, isn't it remarkable? We free up 80 to 90,000 people in Aleppo. We actually, for the first time in months, well, years, give them access to food and water and proper supplies. And what are the Western powers talking about? Increasing the sanctions. So we've got Westminster now. It's a criminal elite. It is out of control, and it's prepared to do anything in any nation in order to further its, I'm going to say, globalist aims. As you say, very dangerous.
Absolutely, and of course, we rightly criticise Westminster, but let's not forget British media, and particularly Channel 4 News, which continues to be absolutely, can't even think of an adjective for it. They are appalling in their presentation of the situation in Aleppo, and continue to be unbelievably aggressive with people coming on to be interviewed. But let's just bring this one up from Reuters. Aleppo rebels hope to reverse fortunes with new alliance. So the remaining terrorists in eastern Aleppo, who haven't necessarily been the best of friends up until now, are now trying to reorganize themselves. And what's interesting from this article is that it hints at some form of centralized control, possibly from Turkey. And so the Syrian military, I've been told, are pretty concerned that there's a sting in the tail as they deal with the final parts of eastern Aleppo, that there's something waiting for them there. They obviously don't quite know what resources these people have in eastern Aleppo, but there certainly seem to be hints that this is starting to reform. And just before we move on from this, a quick reminder that Vanessa Beeley will be heading back to Syria in the not too distant future. Would like a little bit of financial support if anybody's willing to. If you'd like to help her with that, please go to her website, which is thewallwillfall.org, and there's a donate button there. Okay, Brian, the Conflict Stability and Security Fund.
Yes, well, this is remarkable. Sometimes when we're putting items together for the news, you start off going one direction, you're not quite sure what you're going to get. I found this, and I was very intrigued. So here we are. We've got a debate that was going on in Parliament. This is 28th. National Security Advisor questioned on the Conflict Stability and Security Fund. And I'd never heard of that. I didn't know what it was. I certainly didn't know it had £1 billion to play with. I think if you just move on that slide, here we are. Yeah, the background and likely topics for discussion. The CSSF is a pool of government money worth more than £1 billion a year that is spent to address conflict and instability overseas. Now, the inference for this, of course, is this is all milk and honey and kindness. This is the British government looking at how it can assist in areas of conflict overseas. £1 billion made available. But as you dig into it, you actually get a sense that something very, very nasty is taking place. So if we follow through with the next slide here, this is the famous Margaret Beckett, an MP, I think not known for her immense intelligence, but she was questioning a variety of people as to how they've been spending this £1 billion. And I think we should be able to call up a highlight. There we are. These are some of the witnesses. And I was just fascinated. Who are these people who've got access to £1 billion worth of UK government, and how is it being spent to help people? Well, follow on through, because I thought the best way of dealing with this was a diagram. So one click and we should call up the relevant parties. Here we are. So we'll start and work round clockwise. We've got Dr. Stephanie Blair, a director from Opium.
It does look like opium, doesn't it? But it's
it does look like
opium.
opium. Yeah. But fascinating, because this company, which is worth about £63,000, is just Stephanie and another man. So I wonder how they suddenly have access to £1 billion. Then we've got Rueri Nolan, head of research and engagement at Peace Direct. So here's one of the famous charities and NGOs, and if you dig into them, you're not sure what they're about. We've got Adam Smith International, Miles Bush. He was one of the witnesses, and I'm going to come on to them in a minute. We've got Rebecca Crozier, head of Middle East and North Africa Programme, International Alert. And then what a surprise, we got the World Bank. But of course, if you look at their website, they may be the World Bank, but they are working for health and happiness and well-being of everybody in the world. And we've got Actis, with a very interesting little symbology on the A. And this is tied in with the University of Exeter. So my question is, who are these people, and how have they got access to £1 billion, and what are they doing with it? Well, if we follow through, let's have a look at Adam Smith. And they're boasting that their work has been outstanding in raising taxes in Afghanistan. So we've got one of the most poorest countries in the world smashed to pieces by British and American military action. And in comes this organisation funded by the British government who says, don't worry, we're pulling more taxes out of Afghanistan. And if you press the button, Mike, we should be able to bring up the boast. Here it is. It says, we've overseen tax revenue rise from US $230 million to $2 billion.
This is drug revenue, isn't it?
Well, it seems that we've got a country being milked. So this fund, this £1 billion that the British government has put up, is nothing to do with calming areas of unrest. It's nothing to do with helping rebuild nation states. This is introducing a criminal banking cartel. And I'll emphasize where this goes, because if we bring on the next slide here, I was totally unaware of this organization, which is called the Stabilization and Conflict Learning Resource. And we've got a Mark Bryson Richardson, who's the Stabilization Unit Director. So the headline leads people to think that this is the British government doing its best to calm things down in areas of unrest. But I think something much dirtier is going on. So let's have a look at one of their publications here, which is on the next slide. Conflict Sensitivity Tools and Guidance. And if we go to the next one, this is the key bit. What is this guidance for? It's delivering Her Majesty's government's national security objectives effectively in fragile and conflict-afflicted states. So this is nothing to do with helping people. This is nothing to do with charitable work. This, as you've described, Mike, is a pernicious case of British soft power to get into countries in order to hollow them out from the inside. This is appalling stuff. And really, if you want to know why they had to protect Blair, they had to protect Mr. Blair, because if he goes down and we start to see proper investigation, all of this is going to come out. The British government is creating this war and unrest and destabilization of overseas countries. Syria at the moment is the classic case, but it's being done under the banner of charitable works. This is obscene.
Absolutely. Well, let's come back domestically then, and the police. We've been covering the militarization of the police recently, and of course, militarization of the police is part of the transformation of police. So the government has announced today £26 million awarded over the next 3 years to support 28 transformational policing projects. Now, we covered this recently, not quite the same thing. This was a previous tranche of funding, and this is through the Transformation Fund. So the Police Transformation Fund, hundreds of millions of pounds over the next spending review period, will be used to transform police capabilities in response to the changing threat. The fund will be police-led and approved, owned and driven, and the fund will be used for service transformation aligned to the policing vision. So it will, they say, build new capabilities to respond to the changing crime threat and support a strategic shift to prevention of both crime and non-crime related demand, and so on. So we did cover this in the past. And so they said the changing demand and fiscal pressures means we need to think imaginatively and radically about policing. Recent falls in crime and steady public confidence risk masking the need to respond to challenges such as globalization, digitization, and new threats. And they're saying that they need to reimagine the whole system, not incremental reform. So this new tranche of money, Brian, is because they've reimagined the whole system, but they're not going to be slow about this transformation. It's going to be a very fast transformation now. And again, it sort of suggests to me that they're feeling like their backs are up against the wall and they've got to come out fighting. And this is what they're putting this money into. Well, what did Amber Rudd have to say? She's the Home Secretary. She said the Police Transformation Fund is a real opportunity for police leaders and police and crime commissioners to transform policing for the future and to respond to the changing nature of crime. I'm delighted that more than £60 million has been awarded to groundbreaking and collaborative projects this year alone. So the other thing that we highlighted, if you remember, in the earlier tranche of money, was this organisation, Police Now, which is bringing graduates directly into high-level positions within the police service, so they're not getting sort of boots on the ground experience before they get into managerial roles. And of course, this is a pretty dangerous thing to say, and we can't let this one pass without bringing in Brandon Lewis, our favourite government minister for policing. He says we want to finish the job of police reform, and through schemes such as the Police Transformation Fund, it is clear that forces can collaborate on innovative solutions to complex policing problems. But what they're doing here, Brian, is transforming the police, as they say, but to a form that we certainly have never seen before. And we were certainly never asked if this is what we wanted to see happen.
Well, absolutely correct, Mike. What is coming in very, very quickly is a dictatorship. We know that, of course, we've got this massive state spying system. What do you need in a dictatorship? Well, you don't need friendly bobbies on the beat. What you need is a vicious paramilitary police force. So when they're talking about transforming the police, they are talking about paramilitarization of the police. They're talking about integration of the police in with other security services and the spying network. This is a dictatorship. And the words collaboration, transformation, imaginative, those words are the new hypnotic language. This is the language of the government machine, which is changing everything around us. They don't care whether we've asked for it or not asked for it. This is the drive. This is immensely dangerous. And of course, it's all been done on the idea that there's this world terrorist threat. We're all going to be murdered in our beds. Where has the terror threat come from? Well, that's been manufactured by the British and US governments in order to follow the rest of this agenda through. But we've seen already on the news today, we've got Alison Saunders saying we must stay locked into the European Arrest Warrant. We know that Europe is principally militarized police, and now we've got Brandon Lewis saying we're going to get more of that here in UK. They're rushing this through. And I'll just add to this that I was told yesterday or the day before that Dennis Skinner, a wonderful old Labour politician, he asked somebody about what they thought was happening in the country, and they said there's a dictatorship being installed by the Tories.
And on that note, Brian is gone. Well, that's unfortunate we didn't hear the end of that story, but we're pretty much at the end of the program anyway. I'd like to thank Brian for joining me today. Hopefully he'll be back in the studio tomorrow. I'd like to thank all our viewers for watching today, and we will be back at 1 p.m. as usual tomorrow with David Scott. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you then. Bye-bye.